Insurance isn't our only passion at UFG Insurance. We're dedicated to supporting the communities where we live and work. We proudly offer our employees paid time off to volunteer. Their work is making a positive difference across the U.S. UFG's Go Beyond Award is presented to one employee annually for exceptional community service. Striving to deliver on our promises is more than what we do. It's who we are. For a company promising community support, think UFG.
Well, welcome to the Property Tax Tug of War. This is session number 3 in the Economic and Community Development track of the Gazette's Iowa Ideas Conference. I'm your moderator, Sarah Conrad Baranowski, Managing Editor of the Gazette. And I'd like to recognize Iowa Ideas presenting sponsor, ITC Midwest, as well as the sponsor of our Economic and Community Development track, UFG Insurance. Thanks to them for making this session and the entire 2-day conference possible. During our time together today, we'll talk with our panelists and address audience questions. If you have a question at any point during the session, please type it into the Q&A box on your screen, and our tech host will forward it to me. This session is being recorded, and closed captioning is available. If you have any tech questions during the session, put those in the chat box, and our tech host will address them. And if you didn't get enough of this the first time around, you want to go back and watch the recording, all of those are available at iowaideas.com. Let's get started. We have a lot to talk about today. I'm joined by 3 panelists. They are Mark Jackson, Story City's City Administrator, Mickey Shields, Director of Membership Services at the Iowa League of Cities, and State Representative Dave Jacoby, who represents District 86 in Johnson County. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mickey, we're going to start with you. No pressure, but can you give us a brief overview and kind of set the scene for our discussion today? Not everybody follows state government and local government as much as some of us do. But what legislation has been passed in recent years that affects the way cities and other taxing bodies like counties and school districts can levy property taxes?
Sure. And first of all, thank you all for being here, and thanks for the Gazette and the Iowa Ideas Conference for having me and inviting me. An important topic. It's something that probably bores most people to tears, talking about property taxes, and it's very complex. And so I'm going to try as much as I can to get this condensed down. Whenever we educate our own members, city officials about property taxes, we always say you got to start with property values. And there's 2 things you got to look at: the assessed value and then the taxable value. They are different things. The assessed value is just the market value. Whatever the fair market value dictates, the assessors go out and say this property is worth this based on the size of the home or the building, the age, last time it's been renovated, and then comparable sales. Comparable sales is the biggest component to that. When they look around the community and say, okay, it's now worth this because sales are going up or they're going down. And that's a key factor or key thing to remember. In recent years, last couple of years, property assessments have gone up in most communities, but they can go down too. We've all lived through periods where economically we're maybe going through a recession or something like that, and property values reflect that, the assessed value. And then the taxable value is dictated by what is called the rollback, and that's been in place since the late 70s. I think 78 was the first year, something like that. And that is a system designed to curtail the growth of taxable values. So the assessed values can do whatever the fair market says it needs to do, but because of this rollback system, the taxable values are suppressed. And so a prime example of that is residential property. Right now, the taxable value is 46%. So you take whatever that assessed value is for a residential property, you lop off 54% to arrive at your taxable value. That's a key thing to always keep in mind anytime you talk about property taxes. And here recently, there's been some major overhauls to the system. Again, there's a lot of components to this, but I'll try to highlight the biggest ones. In 2013, there was a bill that was approved by the legislature that essentially, among many things, essentially took a 10% rollback applied to commercial industrial property. Those properties traditionally have been taxed at their full assessed value, so the taxable value and the assessed value matched at 100%. Well, this bill gave them a 10% off, essentially, on their taxable side. At the same time, though, the legislature understood that local governments, like city governments, said if you take 10% off of their taxable value and we keep our property tax rates the same, what happens? Well, 10% less in revenue up thereabouts. What happens? So the legislature approved a backfill funding mechanism to basically pay back local governments that loss of revenue. As time went on here a couple of years ago, that backfill funding was reduced. It'll eventually be eliminated here soon. And then another major bill was passed a couple of years ago that did a number of things, but the main thing that has got our members concerned is that if your assessed, or I'm sorry, taxable values increase by certain thresholds or they go past certain thresholds, the general fund revenues will be reduced by 1 or 2% correspondingly. And so that has put in a system that basically can reduce revenues coming from your general fund if certain triggers are hit. They also eliminated a handful of levies that cities used to be able to utilize. And so they came up with a combined general fund levy that it kind of is every city now has to use. That's going to be in place for 3 more fiscal years after this one before they've come at a hard cap with a general fund levy. And so that's those are the big things. Again, there's 1,000 things we could talk about with property taxes, but that hopefully gives people kind of a general picture of where things stand today.
It was an excellent overview. Like I'm going to go back to this video whenever I need a refresher on it.
Thanks. Yeah.
So follow up, like thank you for explaining all of that. But what kinds of things have you heard from your members about these changes? League of Cities, your members are cities, the big and small. What are some of the impacts on them and, as they're budgeting or planning for their future?
Yeah, and I would just quickly, again, the League of Cities, we're a nonprofit association, and our members are the city governments themselves. There are 939 incorporated cities in Iowa currently. We have 860 members, many of which are small communities. Iowa is a city of or state of small cities. We always stress that. There are 500 cities that are less than 500 in population in Iowa. So most of what we do is working with those smaller communities. But the big cities too, and part of the concern with the property tax system itself, whenever the legislature makes changes, it's really wholesale. But not every city is experiencing the same thing, and that puts some pressures on different cities. In particular, with this recent legislation that reduces revenues if your assessed or taxable values grow by certain thresholds. Well, not every community is growing rapidly. In fact, most of Iowa's communities are not growing substantially or at all. In some places are actually declining in population and also declining in property value. And so some of these systems put a larger amount of pressure on those communities that are not really growing or expecting to grow anytime soon. The other thing I always stress through this work at the League of Cities is that not every city wants to be growing rapidly. They don't want to experience 50, 100% population growth over a 5-year period like you see in some of our different pockets around the state. Many communities in the small or rural parts of our state, they want to be small and rural. They want to be a quieter place, a bedroom community, if you will. But they still want to be stable. They still want to be vibrant. They still want to be a good place to live. And so they still need the resources locally to be able to do that and offer that to the public.
Okay. Representative Jacoby, we're going to jump to you. You supported the property tax reform bill this year, which got almost unanimous approval, which is rare in the Iowa legislature in some cases. Why did you decide to support it? What did you like about the bill? But also, where do you think it fell short? What do you wish it had in it or didn't have in it that got passed?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be able to discuss property taxes. As I've said a million times, anytime we talk about property taxes and rollback, the only thing that rolls back is people's eyes, because it is a complicated system that we truly need to simplify. I did support the bill in 2023, but it's important to know the history. We started down a slippery slope in 2013 with a property tax bill that almost passed by the same numbers. At that point in time in 2013, I was a no on that bill because what it did is it favored commercial and industrial, but left out residential. So what we've seen over the last 10 years is the increases in residential liability is due to that tax bill in 2013. So in 2023, there was a bipartisan effort to make it more meaningful or successful with residential homeowners. And that was the intent. What we're finding though is that two things happened, is this indirectly or directly messes with voter approved levies. And as Mickey mentioned, there's a penalty for cities if they grew too much. That's kind of ridiculous to penalize a city for growing more than other cities. So I think the main thing we need to do as legislators, which we've not done in a year or two after the bill passed, is we need to review. We need to review whether the bill was successful and also review where we've hurt local government, where it was not meant to hurt local government. As I mentioned, when you have voter approved areas and also in those growth mechanisms. And I come from local government, and my personal opinion is I wish we had more people in the state legislature that had local government background, which school boards, city, or county offices. But in closing for my time here, I think what you're seeing is when we talk property taxes, there's Democrat and Republican, but also when you're looking at property taxes, you're looking at urban and rural and Eastern Iowa versus Western Iowa. And if you're a geek that reads a lot of the legislation, there's a favorable tilt to cities that are 25,000 and under, as opposed to cities that are over 25,000. It's meant to help smaller areas that may be struggling, but it doesn't make sense to me to penalize our larger cities if they're experiencing growth. So basically, some of the pieces of the bill were good. I voted yes, but we do need to go back and look at that bill along with Mickey and along with Mark to make the correct adjustments.
And you're talking
You
about
just scared Mickey.
Happy to help.
well, there you go. You have the beginnings of a committee.
Right.
So Representative Jacoby, you were talking about, I think you were referencing that these bills help homeowners or help property owners, or they would like to see their taxes decrease. What kind of response did you get from constituents? And when I say constituents, I mean property owners, but also local government officials back in your district or outside of your district. I mean, what feedback did you get on this bill?
Well, most of the feedback I've received from our local government is, what the hell were you thinking? No. Actually, most of the feedback has been good and asking for details on how to work within the new construct for the reporting. And one of the very, very positive things I feel in the bill is a division where we give people 65 and older a break in their property taxes. Because that's one thing I've heard from many people in my district is, I want to stay in Iowa, I want to stay here. But when they live on a fixed income, the volatility of their property tax bill could affect whether or not they can stay in their home. So I think that piece of the bill was well written. As I mentioned before, we need to review. I'm already hearing from people saying the bill did not have the effect that you expected it to have. And when you explain to people, well, your increase is less than the increase if we wouldn't have passed the bill, then people are looking at you going, yeah, good one.
Are there, I follow up to that, are there specific things that you like that you think that not only you would like to change in the bill, because you've mentioned it a couple of times that you want to go back and look at this bill, but that you think could get bipartisan support to change?
Well, interesting. There's been a good push. I've worked with a Republican senator, and she and I have been working on correcting both the penalty for growth and the voter approved areas. Because that's directly affected libraries. It affects veterans commissions. It affects other areas where the locals have voted for those levies. And there is a push. In fact, we made a late push, but we just couldn't get it in front of the Ways and Means committees in both chambers. But if I'm reelected, that's one of my top things when we go back. Let's sit down and actually include the League of Cities, include our city managers, and see what we can do to make it both effective, but also workable for our local governments.
And you're referencing those voter approved levies, like Cedar Rapids has the municipal band levy, or some cities have the library levy that Mickey was saying now some of those are eliminated or they have to be rolled into the general levy. Is that correct?
That's correct. And Cedar Rapids is also directly affected by the Veterans Commission.
Yes.
Because they had the approved levy there also. So those are some of the things I think we can work on.
Okay. Mark, I don't want to leave you out of this conversation. You've been city administrator in Story City for more than 30 years and have surely had to adapt to many changes handed down by the state legislature. How have these recent changes ranked as far as complicating things for Story City? Has it been difficult to adjust? What does the budget process look like for you?
So, it's interesting that you name this tug of war because, when you think of the game of tug of war, there's two even sides to it. And I would say, the state side is like the Iowa Hawkeyes or the Cyclones offensive line. And on the other side is the cities, and we're like the cross-country team. All the power and all the strength rests with the state. Although we have the speed on our side, we don't have it on this side. So actually what I think about, and I'll go back farther than Dave, because, one of the things about 30 years is some institutional knowledge. It's not just the 2013. You go back into the late 1990s when they eliminated taxation on machinery and equipment. And that had a devastating impact, in particular, manufacturing towns along those river towns that had a strong manufacturing base, or your Webster cities or your Newtons. So this whole thing of property tax reform and its adverse impact on cities goes back nearly 30 years. I always look at this is like a game of, if you ever play with your kids Jenga, you've got those blocks, and when you start pulling stuff out, each side says, we pulled out this piece, and I think we pulled out this piece. Mickey said some on commercial industrial. Dave said some on seniors. Well, you know what? You're about to pull out a piece, and it's the whole thing is going to collapse. And I'd say we're sort of near that point. So how does this bill rank? You just keep pulling out pieces, folks, because eventually we're kind of getting near that tipping point that I see that. So when you say how does it impact Story City, I always say we've been fortunate that we've been able to thread that needle, that we've grown, but we haven't grown rapidly like you would see in some of the suburban communities. And we haven't had the stagnant growth that you may see along maybe some of the river towns or in southern Iowa. My point has always been, as I travel the state and do other things for other cities, is that, when I start saying that things are really difficult in Story City and they're kind of heading that way, it means it's a lot worse off everywhere else. So how have we adjusted? It's sort of like this. I'm a Star Trek fan, and Captain Picard said, we must anticipate so we don't make the same mistake once. So and then coming from Michigan, because I was born and raised in Michigan, and you're sort of used to down economic times and its impact on budget. And as a city manager back there, you have to anticipate that these things are going to happen. So we're always anticipating, almost, I hate to say this, a worst case scenario type of thing. But right now it's just trying to find that balance. But my concern is this: I think they're about ready to pull out some of those last pieces where this whole system just collapses. It's a game of Jenga.
I appreciate your analogy. What are some of those last pieces? Not to give them like targets to pull out, but
I think it's what they've taught. It's, it's already out there. I think we're going to talk about this. It's putting a cap on revenues. And I know we're going to get into this later on, but that's probably one of the, when you're saying is, okay, Mark, you've threaded this needle. You haven't stagnated. You haven't had rapid growth. You've threaded the needle. Where's your concern at? There's my concern right there.
Well, has this changed the way that you budget? Has it changed how you're spending the money that is available to you? Or is Story City looking at it and saying, we can't have certain things because we really need to focus on these essential services?
Well, so in terms of change, I'll say the state legislature has been very consistent, and that what they've done in past years with almost all of these bills is there always has been this, and Mickey gonna smile in a minute when I say there's always this promise that we're going to backfill or reimburse the cities for their lost revenue. And, it sounds good for a period of time. And then now we're in a process of phasing out from one of the last bills. We're phasing out that reimbursement. So I always say, whatever the state promises, the state going to take it away. And so I think that's one of the things that we anticipate is we're not going to be receiving those revenues. So even though they say we're going to reimburse, I'm always planning for we're not going to. And so our budgeting always has to be based on that. And so, so right now it may be delaying in capital equipment purchases, and it may be delaying in certain other small capital projects type of thing and putting those off. And that's why I think you see a lot of in a number of cities, the growing list of just maintenance and replacement. And I see this, like I said, in a lot of cities that I deal with and work with, I'm seeing the same thing across the board.
Is this something that, this is a follow-up from Mark, is this something that you think Story City residents realize is happening, or do you think they have a grasp on what their property taxes go to and how these changes at the legislative level may affect their city services? Do you think there's that awareness?
Well, I think they view it in silos. People view, they don't view it together in terms of revenues and expenditures. I think there's several things. One, they look at, first of all, they'll look at their assessments, and we know what happened assessments last year. And it was a great political lead-in for the state legislature to do what they did. If it hadn't grown by double digits, we probably wouldn't have seen much of this at all. And I'll use an example of one individual homeowner. His assessment or their assessment went up 26%. And everybody sees 26%, like, oh my God, my taxes are going up 26%. For their city taxes in Story City, they went up $7.
For the year?
That's like 0.7%. So that's hard to differentiate. And then the other part is what Mickey kind of understands, and where it gets complicated is this whole notion of rollback. 1 year we're in the 50s, some years, and then we're in the 40s, and it's this constant, back and forth. And if I remember right, in Michigan, like I said, I'm going back a long ways as a manager there. It was just at 50% because everybody could understand 50%. Type of thing. So, yeah, they understand that, but it's almost like, sometimes we look at the federal government and we see there's just these unlimited resources, and then it kind of trickles down to the state and it trickles down to the cities, and I think we're in an era where residents sort of think that there's unlimited financial resources for these services, but I want somebody else to pay for it.
Yeah, but they still want the services.
They still want the service. Well, I wrote this at the very, I wrote this at the very end because I jotted down some notes.
Yeah.
This is what it is. And it was a quote from a British prime minister. Everyone is in favor of particular expenditure and general economy, which means everybody wants, Mickey wants pools and he wants parks because he's got young kids. Dave, he's an old guy. He wants money to go to the senior citizen center. I got people that read. We want to go to the library. No, we don't need money for the library. I wanted to go here. But we're all in favor of economic growth. I think to sum up everything, what people see is that particular expenditure and general economy.
I think that's a great sum up. Um, so Mickey, your membership is diverse. It's small towns, like you said. I didn't realize that there were 500 with fewer than 500 people. Is
That's
that
right.
right?
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, how did their challenges vary depending on their size? You got into that a little bit earlier. Some of them don't want to grow, but some of the, others are seeing tons of growth. And, how does that vary and how do their challenges vary by their size?
It's one of the things that we stress a lot, and when we talk about like home rule or local control, it's about the local powers, but it's also about each community having their own set of needs and wants and community characteristics. Not every city has the same type of tax base. When you think about, some cities are fully residential, others have a lot of commercial industrial, and that changes the property tax picture greatly from town to town. And then the size too. And that comes into what kind of services are provided. Many of our smaller cities don't have a police department, for example, and they contract with the county sheriff. And so there's just all kinds of things like that. And I think one of the things that, as we're talking about this, that comes up in my mind in the last couple of years of how many city officials, they think lowering the tax burden is a good and worthy goal. They definitely want to only charge the bottom tax rate possible in their communities. Many of our council members own businesses and obviously own property in their city. And so any type of property tax decision affects them personally and or their business. And so they know it all too well, what the different options on the table, what it's going to mean locally. But I think at the same time, all of our local folks, and I'm sure this Dave and his colleagues in the Capitol feel the same, is that we have also a whole bunch of service demands from the public that Mark alluded to. They're talking about parks and trails that have just become absolutely necessary to be a community that's going to serve your public, let alone the basics, roads and bridges and clean water and public safety and all the things that we just count on every day that frankly many residents probably take for granted because most cities are doing a really, really good job of providing those services without interruption and without delay. Sometimes our members will say this, we're probably too good for our own good, that people can take us for granted. But that is part of our effort here across our spectrum of cities, is trying to help maybe re-educate the public on, like, this is what your property taxes pay for. Whether you're a small town where it's got maybe a bit more basic, or a big city where you're trying to do everything under the sun. We call them full service cities. They've got it all. They've got public works, they've got public safety, libraries, splash pads, and municipal aquatic centers and the like. But that's what property taxes are paying for. And those are the things that people cite more often than taxes, quite frankly, when they make decisions about locating in this community or that one, or doing business in this community or that one. They wanted to do business or live in a place that is known for having a vibrant community and lots of things to do with my family, and it's safe and it's clean. Well, most of those things are being done by your city government, and so they need support, like any organization does financially. And for cities, most of that is coming from property taxes. That's the one stable source of revenue traditionally, that we can count on. And so that's the yin and yang to this, or really the debate, even among our own membership, again, who most of them want to only charge the absolute bottom tax rate possible to do all the things that the residents need them to do.
Right. I don't imagine there are many city governments that want to raise property taxes for no reason because they also are paying those property taxes.
Right.
I don't
Well, and the other thing, and the other thing is we're, in a story city or really in any town, raising them, we hear about it first. I mean, that's what it really comes down to is, and I live about 4 blocks away. So when I really walk to and from work every day, I'm going to hear about it. I mean, so that's the bottom line as well, is you're going to hear about it.
Well, and part of the legislation requires now that residents get, or property owners get, a statement that shows their more I guess not accurately, but gives them a snapshot of their assessment and their taxes and lets them know how to get involved. So hopefully they are reading that and
That was
getting.
a great piece of that legislation. I will say, that was the part in favor of. Yes.
Have you seen, Mark, since you are in a city and people are letting you hear about it, did you hear a response when people got those statements for the first time?
Yeah, we had a couple come to the public hearing and they wanted us to raise the levy rate because they wanted us to fund some additional services in some areas.
Which I think is just, that's not what I would have guessed. I would have guessed that people would show up and say, why are my taxes this?
And didn't hear from any of my colleagues, and I don't know if Mickey with other city officials, if they had where there was an outstanding or a significant increase in those attending public hearings.
No, and that's really been the case for many years. It's probably reflective again. I mean, I hate to make too many assumptions. People can make complaints about their local governments, and they do. But most cities, and I assume counties and schools, do a pretty good job, and they don't get a ton of people showing up for any public hearing, including the budget public hearings, which there are two of. To give opportunity for folks to come and voice their support, voice their opposition, voice their ideas on how to allocate the funding and so on. And so that's always been the case. And I can tell you across our membership, big cities, small towns, they all work hard to get the public engaged. They want people to attend their public hearings and tell them, because otherwise the council, they will tell you that in some cases, we're kind of taking a shot at the dark. We don't know exactly if we have support or opposition to this or that idea. We would much rather have the public come and tell us at these hearings, but oftentimes it's maybe one or two people, and it's the same one or two people that do show up. All that being said, as Mark said, our membership is highly supportive of the tax statement. The original form had some issues with it, but I think we got those ironed out with the legislature's support last year as kind of a cleanup bill that I think will make those statements a lot easier to follow for folks. And so that's a great element from that legislation a couple of years ago to just try to get people a little bit better information about the changes that are happening to their taxes and their assessed values and so on. And so, education is always at the heart of this. Property taxes are very complex in this state, so any little bit can help.
Mickey, I wanted to follow up with you. It's been alluded to a couple of times, I think, so far in this conversation that the latest legislation could penalize cities that grow too much. And I wondered, and I've heard this just through our reporting here at the Gazette, that some cities are talking about maybe trying to control how much they grow so that, they grow just enough that they can capture that new revenue, but not so much that they are penalized for it. Are you hearing rumors of that? Or do you think that may be kind of an unintended consequence of this legislation?
Yeah, it might be. And I think Dave talked about this a little bit before about sort of penalizing growth. And that's, I think, for most of our members, just counterintuitive. Like, again, there's a lot of our cities are not trying to be growing at a rate maybe you see in those high pace or high growth communities like Waukee or Tiffin in the eastern part of the state, North Liberty, certainly some others. But they need a little bit of growth year after year, kind of inflationary growth to keep up with inflationary expenses. That's part of this whole side of this equation. A lot of times the legislature focuses on the revenue side of the equation, but we kind of forget to talk about expenditures. And cities are no different than any other organization out there where you've got some built-in costs that are really outside of your control. You think about liability insurance and health insurance, the cost of a fire truck, the cost of doing one block worth of road work. These things have all increased too over time. And in fact, we have a lot of data that shows city CPI, like growth pricing, has surpassed the normal CPI out there. And so that's part of it too. This going back to your question, Sarah, that is probably the number one concern our members have had since the bill came out in 2023 about basically you can get penalized for growing too much or too fast. So the highest tier is 6%. So if a city's values grow by 6% or more from one year to the next, their revenues are automatically pushed down in the general fund by 3%. It doesn't sound perhaps like a lot to maybe your average citizen, but you're talking about some cities, 3% reduction is substantial. And that's where you start to see some of these higher growth communities looking at development projects and saying, how can we slow this down to get into one of those lower categories so we're not penalized quite as much, which again, in my career, doing this for 20 some years now, I think it's about 20 years, that it's just really counterintuitive. Like it's really hard for a city official, whether it's a city manager or a mayor, to talk and sit down with like a developer or local business owner who wants to expand perhaps their business in some fashion to say like maybe next year or even the year after because we have some other stuff going on and we want to kind of keep this at a lower level across the community. That's again, it's just really kind of counter to how most cities, the ones that want to grow, that's just really counter to what they do when they do their long-term goals and their development plans. It's usually they're trying to be thoughtful of all of it, but for many years growth was good in those types of communities, and now it's like maybe not so much. It's just kind of an odd conversation to have.
Well, and just the growth of 6%, like if you really grow by 6%, like you have more expenses, presumably. Like maybe you're putting in new roads for the new company that's coming to town, or you're doing some kind of improvement project, or more people are moving to town. And so, not being able to capture that revenue for that growth, I can see how that would be difficult for a city that's growing really quickly.
Yeah, and that's a great point because that's like typically when some of this legislation is introduced, and Dave probably knows where I'm going, where some of the rhetoric or some of the talking points, so they focus in on some of those high growth communities, which again, that's not representative of Iowa. Most of our cities are not growing by 6% or more per year. In fact, most of them are not even close to that figure. And that's fine. That's good. That doesn't mean they're doing poorly. That means that there's not a high growth community. And so that tends to be what the focus is on. But even in those communities, you'll look at them and those city officials will tell you, well, yeah, it's, we got all this growth, whether it's commercial or residential or all the above, but it also means we got to pave more roads and we got to treat more water and we got to put maybe a couple more police officers on the street and same with firefighters and EMTs because, more people just means more mouths to feed, more services to provide. And so it's not just all new tax base and all new revenue. In fact, cities try to keep it even. Okay, we grow a little bit more, we get a little bit more tax base, a little more revenue, but that means we're going to have some more expenditures too. And you try to keep that thing really even and stable from year after year.
Well, and the idea that you don't want to tax any more than you need to.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's always at the bottom of it. I mean, we joke about this, and Dave's a politician, so he knows it very well. But no one runs for office on the premise of raising your taxes, whether
Walter
it's
Mondale
local,
tried that in
state, or
1984 and it
right.
didn't work.
Yeah, you just don't do that. But there's also some realities to it because again, council members, I'm sure with school board members and county supervisors, you always, you are in those communities. You know what this tax rate means to folks or versus this tax rate or that tax rate. And so they're constantly trying to go to that, whatever that bottom figure can possibly be to still do all the things that the public wants us to do. That's always that balance you're trying to achieve.
And the problem with politics is it's just too darn political. So that's one thing that we have to couple. And you mentioned that both of you that local people are on the front line. I still remember my time on city council, both my young daughters would not go to the grocery store with me. And I said, well, why? And the youngest daughter looked up at me and said, because we're going to sit around and talk for an hour about property taxes, and I don't even know what the heck that is. So I started going to the grocery store by myself. But I think there are some solutions. And let me back up a little bit. Property taxes were probably the issue I've heard the most about in the last 4 years. So however the discussion came up, other than one or two social issues, which we won't mention in this forum, but other than those couple of social issues, property taxes have been on the forefront of what people have been talking to me about, sending emails and making calls. So when the discussion did come up, it did over the last 3, 4 years, people were thinking about it. And I think part of it, and anyone can correct me if I'm wrong, I think part of it is our demographics in Iowa. We have a number of young people looking to be first-time home buyers. We have a number of people in my age cohort that are saying, well, your house is paid off, and for some reason you pay a little more attention to that property tax bill, because when it was rolled over in escrow, you just made your monthly payments, and that's what I paid to live there. Now I see a lot of people in certain age cohorts that have that bill in front of them, and for whatever reason, they're starting to pay a little more attention. And and some other comments being made, the state requires local government to have all open meetings when we don't do the same. Everything has to be open government. You have to have readings 1, 2, and 3 times to pass an ordinance. We do not do that at the state level. Personally, and both Democrats and Republicans will let you know, I don't go to caucus very often, only when I'm drug in. I don't like private meetings. And I think these discussions are better held on the floor so people get a big picture of everything that you're discussing. So I think and finally, there's some answers, I think. One of them is the state needs to pay for the things that we legislate. The unfunded mandates and the fact that we bail out on cities and counties, whether it's backfill or and then the rollback goes below 50, which I was told it would never ever go below 50, and we're sitting at 46.34 or whatever we are this year. I think state responsibility is a big reason for the increase in residential property taxes.
So, and kind of piggyback off of that, and it's not all the state's fault. I mean, they have their share of blame on this too. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But, really, it's not surprising that this took place. And because part of this does rest with local government. And it goes back to, again, to the 1990s. We got into this the vague term in vogue that has carried out is we can do more with less. And I think that's resonated with a lot of people, that if they had less money, they can still do the same thing. We can do more. That's our own fault for the rhetoric we had from local government. And basically, we should have never gotten into that. And I think the other thing that why Dave's starting to hear that, the assessments were the last straw for people. But the other thing that was alluded to early on is there has been this significant shift from commercial and property owners onto residential. You sort of look at, the elimination of machinery and equipment tax. You look at the rollback of commercial and industrial properties from 100 to 90%. You look at multifamily residential that was at one time taxed as, they're owned by businesses, commercial property, which now are taxed as residential. And so even if you did something with the general fund, you still have other levies like debt service. There's other levies throughout. So there has been this shift that's gone on to residential. Then you add the assessments that took place. You know what? It's not surprising that the state heard about it.
So we've gotten a couple of questions from the audience, and I'll just interject here. We still have other questions, but I wanted to make sure we get to these. One is, if the governor succeeds in her plan of zero income tax, how will this affect property taxes?
Well, there's 2 things in my opinion. Property taxes will skyrocket, and so will sales tax. You can only squeeze the balloon so often, and that rise in sales tax would include probably she would have to start taxing food in Iowa. There's just no other way about it. So that's why I don't see when you can go to 0% income tax. I am a proponent of flat tax rates, but we have to make sure that everyone's paying the flat tax rate. There are too many people, multimillionaires, that don't pay a cent in income tax because of all their write-offs. And that a flat tax will only work if everyone in Iowa above 200% of the poverty line are paying that flat tax.
I'm going to run for governor on the premise of I'm eliminating all taxes and increasing services. because that's sort of the rhetoric that's sort of been out there for years. And I think I could win on that platform. I don't know what everybody else thinks, but that's what we're sort of talking about. But it's like a business. I mean, you just look at, and this is how I look at it here in Story City. It's sort of like a business, and it's not relying on one source of revenue. It's relying on, say, property taxes and sales taxes and income taxes, because property taxes are inelastic and sales and income are elastic. So the concern you might have is that if you're relying solely, say, on sales tax, you're just going to go through boom and bust budgets. That's why it's sort of like an investment. You don't put your investment all into one area, you diversify your investment. And I think it's sort of the same with the state. I mean, if I was governor, that's how I'd look at it.
I've never had anyone announce their gubernatorial campaign on Iowa Ideas Session, but I'm so pleased that it happened.
Hey, it's exciting news.
We'll be sure to get that on the front page of tomorrow's, along with your slogan.
I mean, I would just chime in. So this has been part of the league's efforts in the last few years, or probably longer than that, looking at other states, because there's always sort of a comparison and everyone gets caught up in comparables, and this state's got lower property tax and that state's got lower income taxes, and on and on and on. There's all these rankings and things out there. And for anyone that's maybe not into this world of taxation and is kind of boring and whatnot, I would share with you, from those states that have like a zero income tax, for example, they have much higher other taxes or charges for services and fees, impact fees, you name it. There is no, I mean, as Mark said, I wish there was a way to have everything for free, and great services and all that. But yeah, I think we all understand there's no free lunch out there. And so you're going to have to pay for your public services in some fashion or another.
If you want to talk about economic development, and I'm obviously on the front line when it comes to working with and retaining companies, businesses in Story City. And even when we're recruiting, we don't get asked that question on taxes. It's more of workforce. It's more on education. It's more on quality of life. It's their location to their markets. It's location to the interstate. The only time we get asked about taxes is at the end. They've already made their decision and they go, hey, can you figure out about how much I'm going to pay in property taxes so I can put this in my budget?
Right.
I don't know what else to say on that.
I think that if the governor were here, she would say that by eliminating the income tax, she believes that more businesses will come here. But you're saying like that's not a question that comes up, Mark, that they're more concerned about location and services and workforce.
They want workforce. They want you talk about, I think taxes, all the things we've ever been at, it ranks like 7th, 8th, 9th. It's down there. No, it's your workforce. It's your community. It's the proximity on the interstate. It's close to markets. What's your educational system like? I've got people that are going to be moving here, running my plants and all of that sort of thing. Those are the things they're really looking at. Now, would they take no income? Of course they would. But that's not really why they're looking to begin with. And certainly, go ahead, Dave.
I want to take an opportunity to agree with Mark. But the one thing I learned from my years in local government and actually working at the BioVenture Center here in Coralville, the number one question was not about taxes. When we entertain people who want to start up or move their businesses to our area, was how many kids do you have in kindergarten? And I couldn't believe that question was asked more than a handful of times as people got off the plane and we picked them up. How many kids do you have in kindergarten? And take us to one of your elementary schools. And so I was thinking in the world of taxes and other eco-devo talk, and I was shocked each time when that was the first question they asked.
Because they're looking for the whole package, right? They want quality of life and good schools and employees, and they're not looking at one thing only. It's going to be everything.
They're looking at the land. They're looking at land. How much land is here, and how does this, where I get to the interstate, and it just goes, where are my markets at for this sort of thing? Again, it's a multitude of things. It's not just this one thing, and again, it's not ever rated highly. It's great to run on it. It's just not rated highly.
Mark, I wanted to, so we were talking before the audience question about economic development, and you touched on it some. Uh, is this latest bill going to change the way that Story City approaches economic development? Are you going to say, we'll go after maybe one new company or one growth per year just to make sure we don't, grow too much and then have our revenue capped?
No, I don't think it impacts us in terms of, we've been pretty aggressive. Our city has been on economic development. I don't think that changes. But what it has changed is how we look at, let's say, multifamily residential. When it was taxed, because multifamily residential units are owned by companies and businesses, they aren't owned by residents. When that was taxed at 100%, hey, that was great. Again, I'm looking at this is a business. We make more money as a city that way. That's how we should look at it. Now that it's taxed as residential, it's maybe not going to be a focus economic development wise for us, simply because of that. Because one of the things I have to look at is, how do I keep my property tax rate? We have a low property tax rate. How can we provide the amenities that people want and the basic services? And basically what you find, it is commercial industrial growth that happens. And it's not necessarily the residential, although you want workers and residents and that sort of thing. But that was one area where it did change our looking at and how we focused. Now, that being said, you go forward and you put a cap on, say general fund revenues, it's going to change everything and how you look at economic development.
But you're going to be running for governor, so you don't need to worry about that.
Governor Mark.
Hey, it'd be fun.
Governor Mark.
Poor Mickey would have to be like my press secretary, because then he'd have to go out and
you're not
clean up
roping
all
me
the
in on
statements
this.
I made.
Yeah. Well, Governor
Mickey would rather stay at the league.
Governor Mark is right on the commercial status for our multi-family residential. One of the selling points in 2013, though, is that if we pass that bill, the lease rates, the rental rates will go way down.
Yeah, that didn't happen.
I can tell you from our experience and our daughter's experience that indeed did not happen. And I do hear from many people in the Johnson County area that they're having trouble affording their rent. And remember that these are our workforce people. They need a place to live. So I think there's a critical piece missing in that piece of legislation.
So can we ever go back and say, hey, we passed this 11, 12 years ago. It didn't do what it was supposed to do. Maybe we need to look at this again? Or do we just keep moving forward?
Well, it is brought up often about reviewing past legislation, reviewing tax credits to see which tax credits are effective and are not. And there's quite a deaf ear in the Golden Dome about reviewing anything that's been done previously.
So we're getting close to our time limits, and I did want to get to, we've talked a lot about what has already happened in the past, but going ahead to January and beyond, it seems like taxes are going to be on the agenda again. I believe Speaker Grassley has already said that. What do you think we should expect, Representative Jacoby? What are you expecting?
Well, I always expect the unexpected when it comes to session starting in January. I think there will be a proposal, number one, to reduce income tax rates. I think there will be a proposal, two, to further cap property taxes. I think the review of the property tax bill isn't the review that I'm looking for and what is effective for residential and to keep local governments going. It's important that, I've said it, you can't back the blue and cut the green. It just doesn't add up. We can't keep public safety up there if we're cutting all the green for local government. So I think there's going to be some of those, what I view as negative directions, but there's positive directions we can take too. Number one, I think we need to decouple ag and residential property taxes. I think those ties have been going on for decades, and it doesn't give a true picture of liability. Second, as I mentioned, flat tax. Well, if a flat tax is going to work, it has to be equal for everyone, whether you make 80,000 a year or 20 million a year. The flat tax has to be equivalent across those pay grades. But I'm actually looking forward to input from the people listening in today on what they think January should look like. It's not as important what I think, it's more important what you and they think.
Right. Mickey or Mark, do you have any predictions? What might be coming?
Mickey, you can go first.
You go
Then
first.
clean up what I say.
I want to hear what you're going to say, actually.
So here's where I think we're at. I think the relationship between the state and cities, the state legislature and cities, is at an all-time low. And I'm probably one of the most positive ones about things, but in hearing from members and being at league conferences and things like that, there's a great deal of angst with cities right now. I think we used to have the state and the cities were viewed each other as partners, in particular in providing services and economic development. And we've moved to an adversarial relationship for whatever reason that may be. And basically the hope is that it doesn't move now into this next session into outright hostility, because that doesn't serve Iowans, anyone, well at all. I think there's that. I do think they will, so seriously, because it's already been talked about, putting a cap on property tax revenue. And I think that is that final piece. I mean, I'm not one that's ever cried wolf on a lot of this stuff, but I sincerely have some serious concerns that this will have an adverse, detrimental impact on services and economic development in Iowa. Think of this. When I first came to Iowa, Johnston was a city of 4,700 people. Today, Johnston is a city of 24,000. Had they put a cap on its revenues when they were a town of 4,700, do you think they could have provided police? Do you think they could have provided other amenities that community may wanted, larger libraries, whatever that may be? The answer is absolutely no. There's no possible way. So you have to look at, it may solve a problem, a perceived problem immediately, but where does it go? And then again, we would have to take a serious look at economic development. Because like I said, one of the things that we've looked at is we've been able to keep our tax rate low is because of the economic growth that's occurred. Where is the incentive for economic growth if you're capped at 2%? I mean, seriously, where is it? I've already talked about what could happen in the growing communities. They couldn't provide the services. Now I'm talking in other communities. Where is it? And frankly, when it comes to economic growth, yes, the state does provide certain incentives, but you know who's acquiring the land, who's putting in the infrastructure, who's doing the agreements? It's cities. I mean, cities are the economic engine of Iowa. And so, it's sort of back to the future. I recently read a book about Governor Hughes, who was governor. Of course, he did the great thing of giving Iowans liquor by the glass, I think, in the 1960s. So I don't have to run on that because he already did it, and that was a great thing for Iowa. But, as I'm reading this book, and they were dealing with a couple of issues at that time. You know what the top three issue was? You get a guess, folks. Property taxes. My God.
Well, I hate
They were battling property taxes in the 1960s. It's back to the future, folks. It just goes in full circle always. This
Well,
isn't new.
I hate to cut you off. We are about to run out of time, but thank you so much to the three of you. I really enjoyed this conversation about property taxes. Who says that? But the session has been recorded. It'll be available at iowaideas.com, and I hope you stick around for other sessions that are part of Iowa Ideas for the rest of today and tomorrow. Thank you, Representative Jacoby, Mark from Story City, and Mickey from League of Cities. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much. It
you.
was a lot of fun.